Hey there, this is Ross Izzard. This is the Backcountry Fly Fishing Podcast, where we talk about fly fishing in more interesting places, sometimes overnight. I have gotten so many questions from you all about overnight trips, which is to say, camping trips. Backpacking in particular, but also car camping, and also just sort of questions about when you should be doing overnights. I think this is kind of something that a lot of anglers never really get into, right? They might fish pretty hard, many, many days a year. They may even be fishing some fairly serious backcountry stuff, but they very rarely spend the night outside. And to be honest with you, there's nothing wrong with that. Some people just are not into camping. Other times, for whatever reason, it just doesn't work with their schedules or their lifestyles or their families, and that's all well and good. You can definitely still do some really awesome backcountry, out of the way, exciting fishing, even if you're not camping. But if you really want to access really truly remote water, and if you want to have what I consider to be sort of the full experience of being in these environments and being in nature and connecting with the places and the systems that we are working with as backcountry anglers, then overnights are going to become part of it. Sometimes out of necessity, sometimes out of desire, sometimes just because it's an awesome way to spend some time with yourself, thinking through something, working on something, chewing on an issue, trying to puzzle out a solution to a problem, whatever it might be. It's a huge part of the game. Now, do I spend an overnight out there every single time I go backcountry fly fishing? No, I don't. I have a schedule just like everybody else does. I have children. I have a job, unfortunately for me. And so there are times when I just can't get away with doing that. And in those cases, I probably will do just a really long day trip that involves some significant hiking, getting off into something really interesting, and then making my way back to civilization sometime later in the evening. But whenever I get a chance, especially once it starts warming up, I do love to get out there and spend time backpacking and spend time camping. Not always backpacking, sometimes camping in the back of my truck, sometimes just car camping. It depends on where I might be. It depends on what I'm doing. It's obviously very contextual, but I love doing that because it really does add to the experience. And to the extent that we're really talking about growth of yourself as a person, as an outdoors person, this is a good way to develop other skills that aren't fishing related, right? Backpacking is a skill. Camping is a skill. Solo camping is a skill. And all of these sort of train your self-reliance and your outdoor confidence muscles. Now, that's not to say that that can't happen on day trips. It absolutely can. But there's something about being out there by yourself, especially, but even if you're with a group or a couple of friends, that forces you to adapt in a way that you don't when you know you're coming back to a warm bed and a hot shower and civilization, lights and electricity and screens. It's just different when you are fully immersed in the environment and you're just out there. You're not coming back tonight. You're going to be in a tent. You're going to make the best of it. Maybe you have a fire. You're going to cook your own food, carry your own stuff. That's just a totally different thing. And it does train a different muscle. So yes, you can still have the backcountry fly fishing experience without camping, but really eventually you're going to want to camp just to enhance what you're doing out there. And also because some of these places are far enough away and the circumstances around them are unique enough that you're not going to have much of an option unless you want to cut off, this whole list of places where you might want to access and to fish. And so we're going to spend some time this season talking about backpacking and overnighting and camping as it relates to backcountry fly fishing. And there's quite a bit to that, more than I can do in a single episode. And so we're going to split it out into maybe 2, possibly 3 episodes covering what I think are the most important items and the questions that I receive from you all most often. So we're going to spend quite a bit of time this season working on that in addition to fishing stuff. Today, we're going to start with the most basic question, and actually one that I think a lot of people struggle with because I get asked this all the time, and that is, when does a trip turn into an overnight trip? Now, this seems fairly self-explanatory. The easy answer is, well, whenever you want it to, and of course that's true. But there are cases where it can be hard for folks, especially folks who haven't spent a lot of time doing this, to evaluate when exactly they want to be out there overnight or if they need to be out there overnight. And so we're going to kind of spend some time today talking about my system for deciding when something is an overnight trip, either a single night or multi-nights, whatever it might be. versus a day trip. And there's a lot to this, surprisingly enough, that covers quite a few different topics of stuff that can occur out there and things that you need to be thinking about. I'm going to preface it by saying that obviously your mileage may vary, literally. Different people have different tolerances, different people have different levels of risk that they're willing to accept. Some people just really can't do overnights and aren't going to do this stuff. It's completely up to you, but I can tell you how my sort of thinking around it works and therefore how I prepare for these trips. So that's caveat number one. Caveat number two is that I always have what I need in my bag on any backcountry trip to spend at least one night outside if I had to. So this is like if I get hurt, if I get pinned down in a bad weather system, if something happens that I can't foresee and for some reason I can't make it out before the sun goes down. I always have at least the basic stuff that I need to be able to spend a night outside. Now, that can be as simple as an emergency blanket, some paracord, and some warm clothes. It could be an emergency bivy, which I very often will carry, which is sort of a fancy version of an emergency mylar blanket with a hood that you can zip yourself inside and spend the night staying at least somewhat warm and dry if you had to. Fire starting materials, obviously water filters, some additional food, all of that kind of stuff is with me. Now, am I carrying a full-blown tent with me every time I'm out there? No, I'm not. But I am carrying the stuff that I could use to get through a potentially bad situation for a single night while I was waiting for rescue or waiting for a situation to improve or whatever with me all the time. And so I don't want you to get into the mindset of thinking that just because you're not planning for something to be an overnight, you don't have to prepare for the possibility that you could get stuck out there overnight. Because you can. And that's especially true if you're going way off the trail. It's true if you're off exploring really remote stuff. It's true even if you're just on a long day hike. Shit happens, guys, all the time to people. And it very often happens in scenarios where they didn't expect to be outside. And so being prepared for that with all of your stuff, everything I mentioned, your headlamps, your battery packs, all that kind of stuff is worth it because you never know. You could spend 20 years and never once get stuck outside, but the one time it happens, you're going to be really, really, really wanting to have that gear. So please don't take anything that I'm going to say here today to mean that you shouldn't be prepared. You shouldn't be packed for self-reliance. If you haven't listened to that episode about how I pack for day trips, please go back and listen to it. It's called Packing for Self-Reliance. It's got a packing list in the show notes for you that you can grab and use. But please don't take this to mean that you can show up out there on a day trip without anything that you need with, a Nalgene, a pair of flip-flops, and a 10-liter backpack and be okay. That's not the best way to do it. Will you be okay most of the time? Yeah, sure, probably. Should you do that? No. Are you taking a chance by doing that if you're by yourself? Yeah, for sure. And that's not something that I would advise. So you need to be prepared no matter what, including for worst case scenarios, if you're going to be doing remote backcountry fly fishing of any kind. All right. So with that in mind and those two caveats out of the way, let's talk about when, in my view, something becomes an overnight trip. I'm going to split this up into a few different buckets, but two really big buckets. The first one being controllable factors. These are things that you can control and predict and plan for. The second being uncontrollable factors, which, as the name would imply, are things that you can't control or predict or plan for. And both of them have an impact on what you're going to do as far as making your plans for whether or not a trip is an overnight. So we're going to hit each of those in turn. There are some sub buckets inside of each of those that we'll talk about, but really start thinking about this in the context of stuff you can control and stuff that you can't control, because both of those really do factor into any serious outdoor stuff, including backcountry fly fishing. On the controllable side, the very first thing that you need to be thinking about is mileage. How far are you going? So pure distance. And this is usually measured in the context of hiking distance. Now, it doesn't have to be measured in the context of hiking distance. There are some things that I get into that are short hikes but involve a 5-hour rock crawl or 4x4 road getting out there that can take just as long as a really long hike would. And that's obviously a factor. Same thing for situations where you have really, really long drive time, right? If you're driving 5, 6, 7 hours to get somewhere, obviously that's going to affect what's going to happen once you're there and how much time you have. But really, when I talk about distance, primarily, I am thinking about hiking distance. And there are two sort of subcomponents to this. The first one is time. So how much ground can you cover and in the requisite amount of time needed for you to be able to make it a day trip? And how much can you physically do? What is your endurance level? All right. And both of those factors are highly individual. They're very, very personal. They depend on your level of fitness. They depend on how much weight you're carrying. They depend on how you hike. They depend on your age. They depend on the terrain. They depend on the conditions. There are a lot of variables in there that are almost impossible for me to pin down for you specifically because they're just so dependent on what is going on with you and with the environment that you're in. And that's okay, right? So we're going to talk mostly in rules of thumb here. Now, keep in mind, your mileage literally, as I said before, may vary, which is to say that your calculus on this stuff may change based on your specific factors. And I can't necessarily help you with that, but I can lay out sort of where my limits are. So on the hiking front, in general, I do not want to hike more than, let's say, 12 to 14 miles in a single day. Now, that is sort of the outside. I have done days all the way up to 16 miles. I've actually done days all the way up to 20 miles, which is kind of insane. But those are pretty long hiking days, right? And very often these are sort of out and back hikes. So think high alpine lakes, way up in a cirque somewhere, and you've got to hike 5, 6, 7, 8 miles up to get to the lake before you can fish it. And then obviously when you're done, you're going to turn around, you're going to hike 5, 6, 7, 8 miles back down the mountain to the trailhead and to your parking lot. And that is a really serious commitment, both physically and in terms of time. All right. So if you're hiking at a reasonable pace, and this, again, it depends on what you're on, but I'm just going to take the context of you're doing some serious elevation gain on the way up and then some serious elevation loss on the way down. If you're in a canyon, this could be reversed. You have elevation loss on the way down and then elevation gain on the way out when you're climbing out at the end of the day. But in any case, let's say you're working on, a trail, not really rough route finding off trail stuff, but you're on a trail or something that's at least workable. And you're working with at least some level of elevation gain. Maybe it's 1,000 feet, maybe it's 2,000 feet, maybe it's 3,000 feet, whatever it might be. Your hiking pace is probably going to be somewhere around 2 to 2.5 miles per hour. It can be a little bit lower, depending on your fitness level and how rough everything is and how you feel that day. It can be faster than that. I know on days where I'm super motivated, I will often hit hiking paces that are north of 3 miles per hour, which is fast for hiking, especially with load, and cool. That's fun. But I'm not going to hit it every single time, and it's not something that I'm going to hit reliably in steep terrain or rough terrain. So if we take that 2 mile per hour rule, you can assume that you are probably going to cover, and I know this is going to shock you from a math perspective, about 2 miles per hour. So that means that if you're hiking 4 miles, it's going to take you roughly 2 hours to do that hike. If you're hiking 6, it's going to take you roughly 3 hours to do that hike. If you're pushing to 8, that's going to take you 4 hours to do that hike. And then you should plan for roughly the same amount of time on the way back. Now, it might be a little faster if you're coming downhill. You could be really motivated because the weather's bad. I mean, I'm not saying that it's going to be exactly the same on both the out and the back legs, but you should expect it to take roughly the same amount of time, right? So we are now dealing with situations where you are hiking anywhere from 4 hours on the low end to maybe up to 8 hours on the high end. And 8 hours is a pretty long time, right? That's a full work day. That's a lot of time on the trail, and it does not account for your fishing time, right? So let's say that you hit a trailhead at 7 in the morning. You probably should start earlier than that in the summertime, especially if you're going over tree line because there are thunderstorms in the afternoon. But for the sake of argument, let's say you start at 7 in the morning and you're going to hike 4 miles up a trail. Well, that's going to take you about 2 hours. So you're going to be on the lake by 9-ish. By the time you're set up and ready to fish, 9:15, 9:30, something like that. Then, because you need to be off by noon, you're going to have about 2.5 hours up there to fish before you need to come back down below tree line before those thunderstorms start afternoon. And then you're going to have a 2-hour hike back, right? Which means that reasonably you could expect to be back at your car, back at the trailhead by 2 or 3 in the afternoon. Now, that's fine, right? That's an easy day trip. You started at 7, you climbed the mountain, you did your fishing, you came back down, you're back in your car for afternoon tea, right? You're ready to come back to civilization. Plenty of daylight. Sun's probably going down at 8-ish, maybe a little bit later, especially in the summer. You're good to go, right? No problem. Now, let's say that you're going instead 6 miles. Now it's 3 hours up there, and you're not on the water until 10. Okay, now you have roughly 2 hours to fish before you need to bail out and get blown off by the afternoon storms. And then you can expect 3 hours of hiking back down. So now you're not back to your car until 3. Let's say you push your fishing window a little bit more and you are up there until 12:30 or 1 because the window is looking good. Now you're not back to your car until 4. And you're kind of getting the sense of where I'm going here, right? Which is to say that the longer you have to hike, the longer these days get. And it doesn't take too long to get into a situation where you are not back to your car until sunset or close to it. And there's nothing particularly wrong with that. It's okay to kind of push it, but you need to be careful about how far you push it. I am not a believer really in hiking in the dark. You can do it. I have done it. There are situations where you have to do it. But as a general rule, I think hiking in the dark, if you can avoid it, is not ideal. It is an injury factory. It's a good chance for you to trip or to fall or to get hurt. It's a chance to get lost or to take a wrong turn. There's a whole bunch of stuff that can happen with night hiking that if you really don't have to do it, you shouldn't be doing it. And so the longer these trips get and the further you push that window out, the closer to sunset you get, the more I start thinking about, okay, now maybe this needs to be an overnight, especially if I want to actually have time fishing where I'm going, right? Because really what you're doing is you can't compress the hiking time. That's going to be what it is. So the only thing that really can compress in that window is your fishing time and your start time. And assuming that you already started early and you want to have reasonable amounts of time on the water, that means that you are going to have to really think about that. And my argument to you would be that right about in that 12 to 14 mile round trip mark. So that's like, 6 to 7, maybe 8 miles on each leg. That's right about when you're going to start hitting time issues. And when you start thinking, well, you know what, maybe I ought to camp. Maybe I hike up there, I fish, and then I come back down to tree line and I camp for the night. And then either I can go back up and fish a little bit in the morning and then come all the way back down with plenty of time to spare, or I can just hike down in the morning. But in any case, that's when I start thinking, okay, I might be out here overnight. And that's worth keeping in mind for you. I'm also going to give you one other thing. It's called Naismith's rule. It's Naismith rule. Naismiths. I don't know who Naismith is. I'm sure I could look it up. But anyway, this guy came up with a formula for hiking time that you can kind of write down and keep as a back pocket guide. It's not perfect. It's not the Bible when it comes to this stuff, but it's relatively accurate, and I've used it pretty often. And Naismith's rule says that you should plan in hiking for 1 hour for every 3 miles forward on flat ground, right? That's assuming you're walking on level, flat ground. And then another hour for every 2,000 feet of elevation gain. All right. So you would take your total distance. Let's say that you're going 3 miles in this instance, and you plan that's going to take you an hour if it was flat ground. But then you say, okay, but it's a 4,000 foot elevation gain. Well, now that 1 hour becomes 3 hours. And you can kind of use this as a planning tool. Like I said, it's imperfect. Of course, it's imperfect. It depends on who is doing it. It depends on a lot of things, but it's worth you keeping in mind. So Naismith's rule is a good rule of thumb. If you really are like, man, I just have no idea how long that's going to take me, this is a good rule of thumb for the average hiker. Now, there's another factor to this that I mentioned earlier, which is your physical ability, right? And look, we're going to be real brutally honest here. Your physical ability probably varies pretty widely from mine or from the guy next door or from another dude that you see on the trail. You could be in much better shape, in which case you can move much quicker and these sort of boundaries might expand. You could be in much worse shape or have medical conditions or age-related stuff or injuries that slow you down. But your physical condition matters. And it matters not just in the context of time, right? Like, yes, it can slow you down or speed you up, but it also matters in the context of endurance. So can you actually physically handle this? Which is to say that you are not so smoked that you are sufferfesting your way out at the end of the day or barely making it, putting yourself in a situation where you're dehydrated or dizzy or disoriented or whatever. Because those are really dangerous things, right? That's when you start making bad decisions. That's when you can get lost. That's when you can get confused. That's when you start making judgment calls that can compound into serious issues. They might have been a small problem on their own, but they start to compound. And decision making gets worse the tireder you get. I don't know if tireder is a word, but here we are. And it can start to lead to some pretty dangerous situations on top of the fact that you can have medical issues here, right? Like if your physical condition is not in a place where you can do this stuff, you can have cardiovascular issues, so heart related stuff. You can have pulmonary issues, which is also problematic. You can get sick to your stomach. You can cramp up. A whole bunch of different things that can happen here. And so this is one of those cases where you got to break out the old mirror and you have to be really honest with yourself about your level of physical conditioning and your physical condition generally. Now, you should and can train for the backcountry. I train for hiking all the time. I wear a weighted vest on the Stairmaster. I do weighted incline walks on a treadmill. I lift weights. I do other stuff. So you can and should train yourself for this. It's not a permanent fixed baseline. You can always improve it, and you should be working on that because it'll make your life better. You'll be healthier, and you'll be able to access more awesome fishing. But you also, as you're planning a trip, need to be honest with yourself about where you are from a fitness perspective in that particular moment. And you need to factor that into how far and how much you can do. And so, one guy might look at a 5-mile hike to a lake and a 5-mile back as an easy day trip. He's back in the car, drinking a soda and heading home by 3 in the afternoon, no muss, no fuss. Another guy might think that that's at the very edge of his physical capacity. And if it's at the edge of your physical capacity, if you even think it might be at the edge of your physical capacity, the best thing that you can do is to plan to camp. That should become an overnight trip, right? So now you've got kind of two things going on. Number one is the time factor, which is saying that if you cannot reasonably make that hike in enough time to know that you're not going to be stuck hiking in the dark if you get distracted or caught up or go slower than you expected, you should probably be staying overnight. And if you're not totally sure that you can physically handle the demands of doing it as a day trip, and you think there's any chance that you can't, the best thing for you to do is to treat it as a overnight trip. So backpacking, carrying your stuff up there. Yes, it's more weight. Yes, that's more physical work on you. I'm aware of that sort of paradox here. But trust me, if you're in that situation, the best thing that you can do is to get up to the lake or get up to the river or wherever you're going or down to the river in a canyon or wherever you happen to be. Fish, have your time to yourself to fish and do your stuff, and then camp, and then hike out the next day with fresh legs instead of really, really pushing yourself, because that is where stuff can go wrong. So those are the two pieces that are the biggest factors in the controllable bucket. But there is one more, which is to say that maybe you just want a whole bunch more time to fish, right? And so this is one of the big struggles that I have, especially with, well, I guess with all forms of backcountry fly fishing, but especially with high alpine lakes. You just don't get a lot of time on the water, right? It's not uncommon, especially with longer hikes, for you to only get a couple of hours before you have to get off, either for weather-related reasons or because you need to make it back down in time. And that means that you can get really, really compressed as far as your fishing time goes. And that can be kind of stressful sometimes because you may want to really fish. If you want more time on the water fishing, then you may have to camp, right? That might be the difference between you being able to spend 5 or 6 hours fishing and you being able to spend 1 or 2 hours fishing. And so some of it comes down to that. How much time do you need on the water? How much time do you want on the water? That's something that I factor into these decisions pretty heavily as well. And it's worth thinking about because sometimes it is really nice to be out there and just fish and be unhurried and not have to worry about getting back to something or going back home or being on a timeline, and you're just outside. You're out there to enjoy the environment, to fish, to take your own time. Nothing in the world can get to you. You probably don't have cell phone reception, and it's like you're living in a beautiful alternate reality where you don't have all of those pressures coming at you. You don't have a schedule. You don't have a calendar. You're just in the woods or on the mountain or in a canyon fishing for as long as you want until the sun goes down, and then you're sleeping and you're getting up and you're doing it again. And that is not to be underestimated. It really is a pretty magical experience. So time on the water is another thing that you really need to be thinking about with this stuff. How much time do you need? How much time do you want? Keep in mind that some places can actually take a lot of time to figure out. High alpine lakes in particular. I mean, if you're going to be up there trying to figure out these lakes, they can be kind of enigmatic, right? So it could take you an hour just to dial in what the fish are eating. And if you've only got 90 minutes or 2 hours on the lake, that's not a lot of fishing time. That's something for you to think about. So make sure that you factor that in as well. Now, the second bucket is uncontrollable variables, okay? These are things that you do not and cannot control. There is no level of planning, no level of thinking, no level of experience, no level of skill that is going to mitigate or change these things. They're just going to happen, right? So these are all based on conditions and stuff that can happen out there that can change your calculus from, okay, it's a day trip to, okay, now it's an overnight trip. The first one of those is probably pretty obvious, and that's weather. Okay, so if you were hiking off into the middle of nowhere, let's say again you're doing a, I don't know, 5-ish mile hike into something, and you know that there is weather in the forecast, or even if there's not weather in the forecast, because let's be real, especially for those of you who are fishing in higher elevation places, weather gets weird in the mountains, and the forecast can say it's supposed to be sunny all day, and you can get hammered with a massive thunderstorm, or vice versa. And so you never really know what nature's going to throw at you. But that said, we do need to check the forecast and we need to be aware of sort of what might happen, right? So if you're looking at the forecast and you're like, okay, I'm going to hike up there, I'll be on the water by 9 or 9:30. There's weather forecasted to roll in by 11:30 or noon or 11, and but then it's going to pass by 2 or 3 that afternoon. That's something for you to think about as well, right? In a couple different ways. The first one being that if you think that there is a reasonable chance that you are going to get caught in really severe weather, and this is not just a light spring or summer rain. I'm talking real weather, like hardcore thunderstorms, elevation thunderstorms, hail, wind, all of that, snow in some cases, or ice storms in some cases. In those cases, you're probably going to want to carry a shelter, partially just so you are able to have somewhere to go if things get really hairy, and partially because there are scenarios where you may have to bunker down and ride this thing out because you can't really hike in it safely. You don't have time to get out before it gets there. It can really sneak up on you. And anybody who spent a lot of time fishing in high elevation areas knows this. Those clouds will come ripping over the top of the ridge lines at like 60 miles an hour, and you very often don't have much time to react to it. And so if you know that there are weather conditions that are iffy, right, and that might be an actual forecast, it could be changing barometric pressure, it could be just your general knowledge of the area, then that's something for you to consider, because there are cases where I will hike into something and, in perfect conditions with perfect weather, it would be no big deal to hike in, catch my fish, hike out, call it a day. But in the absence of perfect conditions, or if I think there might not be perfect conditions, there's always the possibility that you're going to get pinned down by a storm or by something else, and that's going to mess up your whole timeline, right? So now this is messing up that whole time piece that we just got done talking about. You might have done all the math and known exactly how long it would take you to do this if the conditions were perfect, but now they're not perfect anymore, and you have to think about that. So I'll give you an example from just earlier this year. I was out fishing in one of my favorite backcountry canyons. I was about, I don't know, 5, maybe 6 miles into it, and I got stuck in a regenerative thunderstorm cycle. And for those of you who don't know, thunderstorms get kind of weird in canyon environments in particular. They will roll in, they'll blow up, and then they actually will regenerate themselves. The cells will keep building, and it's like being in a washing machine. On the ground, it feels like you just have storm after storm after storm stacked up on top of each other, one after another. And sometimes that does happen, but very often it's the same cell just circulating and rebuilding itself. And this was a nasty storm. I mean, we're talking marble to golf ball size hail. I was hiding under a rock, heavy, heavy wind, heavy, heavy rain, lots of lightning. And my way out of this canyon involved having to hike through a very large exposed burn scar. So no trees, no cover. It's a huge thunderstorm. The thunderstorms will not let up. And so I went into this canyon thinking, well, all right, I'm going to hike in there. I'll be on the water by 9-ish. I should be back at the car no later than 5 or 6, and I'll be fine. But these storms are such that I was basically pinned down in the canyon. I couldn't safely move, and I certainly couldn't safely hike out in a burn scar in a lightning storm. Now, in this particular instance, I did manage to make it back to my car. I didn't get back to the car until 7:30, right as the sun was going down and it was getting dark, because we're still relatively early in the season here. And, I didn't wind up having to spend the night outside. But me getting out of there was a really sketchy proposition. I had to basically wait for a break in the storms and then make a mad dash, almost literally 2,000 feet and about 5.5 or 6 miles out of this canyon to get back to my car before the rest of the thunderstorms rolled back in. And in fact, I made it to the car right as the next hailstorm started, and I had to jump in the car and get out of there. Had that been any later, had I not had that gap, had it been more consistent or anything else, I very likely could have gotten stuck out there for the night, which means that, I would have had to find a place to sleep and to be out there for the night, because at that point I'm trading safety, right? Can I actually extricate myself from the situation safely for convenience, which is I don't really want to spend the night in the woods. And in that case, I made it happen, but if it had been even just a little bit different, even another 30 or 45 minutes, probably would have been a very, very different scenario for me. Now, in this case, I did have overnight gear with me, so I was prepared for that. I sort of knew that there was weather in the area. I knew that there was a possibility that I would have to stay out there for the night. And so I did have my overnight gear with me. And like I said, I managed to make it out, but it was probably right on the limit. And so weather is a big factor that you ought to be thinking about. And if you think that you might get trapped or pinned or run into weather that could affect your ability to get in and get out in a timely fashion with daylight, then camping is probably a better option for you. Yes, you might get wet. Yes, setting up a tent in a storm isn't the most fun you've probably ever had, but it beats the alternative. So weather's the first uncontrollable thing. The other thing is unforeseen issues, right? So this can happen really in a whole bunch of different ways. You could run across a rock slide that's blocked off part of the trail, and that's happened to me before, and have to route around it. You can run across flooding on part of the trail, and then you have to route around it. You can find out if you're off trail that your route doesn't work anymore. Maybe it looked good on satellite, looked good on topo, but you get out there and it's really not what you thought it was. Now you've got to sit down, pull out your offline map, and reroute and find a different way. Maybe it's that the terrain is tougher or the vegetation is denser or whatever. And that can take a lot of time, right? If you've ever been seriously bushwhacking, you know how time intensive it is to have to beat through those bushes and climb over deadfall and crawl underneath shit and all that kind of stuff. It can be quite a thing. So that can take time. You can have a gear failure, right? I've had hiking boots blow up on me. I've had my backpack break. I've had something happen with my water bottle. There's all sorts of stuff that can happen. And you just never know, right? When you're outside, one of the cool things is that it's an environment where there are all these crazy variables around you, not all of which you control. And your job is to be as prepared for them, both as far as skills and competence and as far as gear, to manage them as you possibly can be, but with the understanding that like shit happens out there, right? And in fact, that sort of level of, ooh, I don't know what's going to happen is part of the fun for us, to be honest, or at least part of the fun for me. And so you never know exactly what could happen. And those things can pretty quickly turn into time sucks, right? A gear issue can turn into a 30-minute to even an hour problem, depending on what you have, whether or not you can fix it, what type of gear thing it is. Navigational issues, those can turn into multi-hour issues depending on what's going on. If you have to really reroute, or if something really doesn't work out for you, an exit doesn't work or something else, that can really, really, really alter the course of your day. And in fact, I would argue that if you're doing anything that looks like exploration or blue lining or off-trail work, and you haven't been there before and you've only looked at it on topo or you've only looked at it on satellite, it's not a bad idea to be prepared with at least basic overnight stuff in case your exit route or your route in general doesn't work. That stuff can turn into a really long, multi-hour situation pretty quickly. That is more than enough to push you into the territory of needing to deal with being out there for the night instead of attempting to make your way out in the dark, especially off trail. I can't emphasize this enough. I have navigated off trail at night. I've navigated pretty difficult terrain at night off trail, and I made it. I'm still alive. Here I am recording a podcast, but I would not do it again. That was when I was younger and dumber. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. It's not very safe. It's definitely not the correct thing to do if you can avoid it. And so if you've got anything like that, you're doing a long hike, you don't know for sure what the terrain looks like, you don't know what your exit's going to look like, you should plan to run into some unforeseen navigation issues, and you should plan for those to be pretty time intensive, which could lead you to need to do it as an overnight. And then the last thing here is, emergency stuff, right? You could break your leg, and I damn near broke my leg last season, which I told you guys about on that Wall of Shame podcast. I ran my leg through a trapdoor in the snow, very nearly broke it between a rock and a log, and could have been in really big trouble. It turned out I was okay, despite the odds. Great. Very easily could have not been okay. You can get sick. So, you can have, in some cases, an upset stomach for whatever reason. You could have altitude sickness that makes it harder for you to hike, even once you come down to lower elevations. You could get dehydrated. You could get a migraine. You could hurt your back. You could twist your knee. You could sprain your ankle. I mean, there are a million things that could happen that are not necessarily life-threatening, but could result in you needing to be out there for some extra time. And this one is a little bit unique because, I'm not going to advocate for you to walk around with the backpacking pack and full blown overnight gear all the time just because you could get hurt. I don't think that's necessary. But going back to what I said at the beginning of the episode, you do need to have at least basic survival and overnight stuff with you pretty much all the time in situations where that could happen. I keep this stuff in my day pack. Like I said, I have a sort of emergency bivy that I could use to spend a night out there. I sometimes have a tarp. I always have paracord and other things that I could use and spare clothes that I could use to stay out there for the night, along with a fire starter to keep warm and a few other things. Now, would I voluntarily choose to spend a couple of primitive nights or even one primitive night out there doing that? No, I'd rather not, right? I'd rather have actual good quality overnight gear if I'm going to do overnight. But I recognize that this stuff can happen anyway, and so I do keep all of that stuff in my day pack. So go back and check out that Packing for Self-Reliance episode again. Check out that packing list. You can add stuff to it. You can take stuff away from it. Yes, it's a little bit more weight, but having that stuff with you is a really good idea just to help you be prepared to stay out there if you really, really had to and ran into a bad situation. So, guys, there you have it. That's kind of my matrix, if you will, for deciding when something is an overnight and when it's not. It's completely up to you. You can come up with your own system. Obviously, it's going to vary from person to person, but that is how I think about this stuff when I'm trying to decide, okay, am I going for just a day trip or am I going for a full-blown camping trip? And how do I make that call? And then what do I need? We're going to take a deeper dive into what you need for this with a full-blown what I carry episode for backpacking here in the very near future. But in the meantime, I hope that this is enough to get you started as you're thinking about your backcountry adventures in the warmer months as the season proper kicks off. Hope you have an awesome week. Hope you're out there fishing. Stay safe, and I will see you back here real soon. Till next time, this is Ross, and maybe I'll see you out there. I just hope we don't have to spend the night together.